Hello, my name's Harry Blackmore and it's an honour to talk to you. I've been deeply involved in this programme for over a decade. I started my naval flying career off the Invincible class carrier in the mid-1980s, and I end my career witness to the UK's return to carrier strike group operations, alongside a global resurgent interest in large deck carriers. I've been asked to give you a user perspective on the Queen Elizabeth class carrier programme and the UK's broader carrier strike ambition. I, of course, do not imply or presume any of your choices. I merely wish to go through the UK choices and some of the history. It's a good time to talk about the operational concept. We're in the final preparations of our first operational deployment next year. We've just completed very successful workups off the UK in UK waters with US forces embarked, which has unequivocally proved the Queen Elizabeth design. Both in terms of its size and configuration, it gives us flexibility. Over the next 25 minutes, I'd like to give you some of the thinking behind the choice of two 65,000-tonne carriers. It's been a long journey. Up front, I will say, however, notwithstanding the history and the maths and the theory, the lived experience today of the two carriers at sea is that it is good. The size gives us options. We're very proud of our next generation of aircraft carriers. They've been built in close collaboration with UK industry. Several times in this presentation, I'll return to the pervasive importance of people, the close relationship we have with UK industry, whether that's the Aircraft Carrier Alliance who helped build the two carriers, or with UK industry that supply and support the force elements, all of which are essential components of the capability. I'd also like to talk about the people who operate and maintain the carriers at sea today. We will talk about some impressive equipment, but I would like to also consider the non-contracted elements, be that personnel, training, and the transition into service and then subsequent generation. Carrier aviation is, as you know, complex aviation. It's not a pickup game, and it takes time to grow and to normalise. We have a long history of working with our US and French allies in the carrier arena. Over 75 years ago, in the Pacific Theatre, the UK and Royal Navy learnt a great deal from the US Navy. And in some ways, the last decade of support to us in our ambition has been an extension of that deep and long friendship. The Queen Elizabeth class carrier is the only carrier in the world designed specifically with F-35 in mind. Recently, we've had the largest number of F-35 on board, which is the largest number of F-35 anywhere in the world, and she's at half her capacity. These facts speak for themselves, and many will be familiar to you. But I'd like to just draw your attention to a couple of points. The scale and the breadth of the endeavour, I think, is well illustrated by the quantity of material that we've removed from the historic port of Portsmouth, which will be the home port for the carriers for the next 50 years. I'd also draw your attention to the docking cycle, which is to do with the Lloyd's registration every 6 years. And I'll return to that later when we discuss why we have a class of 2 ships. The history path to Queen Elizabeth is long. The size and configuration has been shaped by the strategic context. How you match your operational capabilities to future needs, whilst at the same time holding to a requirement to allow for the production, is a difficult balance, particularly in a long programme. Undoubtedly, the design has been influenced by Royal Navy experiences, understanding what works and sticking to what we like. We were perhaps biased towards Stovall because of our experiences with Harrier. We did, however, have a solid understanding of maritime task group operations, recognising that there are certain constants: resupply of supply chains, self-protection and situational awareness. As I mentioned briefly, as far back as the British Pacific Fleet in 1944, we were working with the US on sustaining carrier operations at range. Post-World War II, the UK exported its carriers widely. Steam catapults, angled flight decks, optical landing sites are all innovations from the UK. The Falklands lesson was a lesson in contested maritime environments that we perhaps had forgotten and we should not forget again. It also embedded the inveritable Harrier into our thinking. More recently, Harriers have shown their versatility in the North Atlantic and in the Mediterranean off HMS Ocean. This all shaped the baseline thinking around Stovall for CVF. Conflicts in the 90s reminded the UK of the importance of sovereign independence, operating without political restraint from other government foreign policy. So this was the decade in the 1990s that helped shape the Queen Elizabeth design path in the early phases. Initial studies into a replacement for the three Invincible classes started as early as 1992. At that time, we were all set in the post-Cold War era. We were also shaped by experiences of the RAF over southern Iraq in the First Gulf War, where there was a reluctance by some friendly Gulf states to permit us use of their airfields. And this shaped UK thinking. Emphasis changed from open ocean ASW, ASUW into a multi-role platform with land attack. So in the run-up to the 1998 Defence Review, there were 9 design options for the Queen Elizabeth class of varying sizes. It's also worth noting there was a significant uncertainty about the future carrier-borne aircraft. We hadn't made that choice at the time. Some things, early decisions, thankfully stuck. Electric propulsion. Subsequently, we learnt a great deal from Type 45. UK industry and the Royal Navy are leading proponents of electric propulsion in complex warships. At an operational level, it's of course worth noting that regardless of the main propulsion of an aircraft carrier, it needs to refuel for aviation fuel. Replenishment at sea is just a necessity of carrier operations. There was also recognition in the early 90s that the Fleet Air Arm was now too small to support and sustain a future generation of aircraft. The creation of Joint Force Harrier, where we combined with the Royal Air Force, set the operating model for the F-35B that is operated today. So 1998 was the first of 3 decisive defence reviews that endorsed the requirement for 2 more versatile carriers. There was much deliberation that followed, leading up to the final down selection of Design Delta in 2004 and then Design Freeze in 2006. And that is that design that we operate today. It's notable that it took us 10 years to translate the political commitment in 1998 into a binding manufacturing contract. There are perhaps parallels in this period with your considerations today. The key driver to ship size is aircraft capacity. Size is roughly proportional to the number of aircraft carried. Various concept studies occurred immediately after the Defence Review of 98, where the tonnage varied from 40 to 80,000 tonnes. The first Alpha design catered for 32 attack aircraft and 16 DCA, giving us a sortie generation rate of in excess of 150. At the time the comment was made, steel is cheap, air is free. But there was concern about the size of the Alpha in terms of our ability to build it in UK shipyards. Also coincidentally in the mid-2000s, the DCA role was traded out. So we were left with 32 FEAR out of 36 jets. This reduced the overall size of the aircraft. We then transferred through the unsuccessful Bravo and Charlie designs and finally settled on the Delta design in 2004. Interestingly, trading out the air defence requirement we might reconsider today as we look at our peer threats. So it's an example where you build in capacity and size for the uncertain future. Similarly, early consideration of the force protection rotary wing assets was that they would be accommodated on the support shipping. Helicopter spots are at a premium in a maritime task group, and there's always a balance of dispersing the single units to smaller ships or keeping larger squadrons and the economies of scale on one large aviation platform. Queen Elizabeth's spare capacity gives us the ability to accommodate a mixed air wing, keeping both the force protection and surveillance assets on board. In CSG-21 next year, our ASW, Crow's Nest and Maritime Intertheatre Lift or MITL helicopters will all be accommodated on Queen Elizabeth. Merlin, an ideal maritime platform, has a commonality across all of those roles, which helps with the aircraft availability. A balanced air wing is as important as the number of tailplanes or jet numbers. A second key driver to the size of the aircraft carrier was the type of aircraft. Conventional aircraft carriers tend to be larger than Stovall because of the cats and traps and steam catapult generation systems. Adaptable was one of the mandates required for the CVF class, so the need to accommodate the cats and traps led us to a minimum size of 40,000 tonnes, broadly equivalent to the Charles de Gaulle, but it was not a determinant of the overall final choice. It is, however, a useful legacy from this time that we have a number of unallocated spaces. Those on 2-deck in particular may be useful for future unoccupied air systems and their control systems, and there are accommodation spaces further down below which might be useful. It's notable that heavier unoccupied air systems may require assistance in launch and recovery in the future, which I will return to later. A third driver for the size of the Queen Elizabeth class carriers was the hangar. The height and width has a considerable impact on the size and shape of the ship. In non-engineering terms, it's the box around which the rigid ship is formed. Slightly larger than the CVN hangar, with storage rooms outboard of the Queen Elizabeth class to optimise the hangar deck for aircraft. These also gave us side protection, but they did drive in size. Helicopter maintenance requires certain heights in the hangar, and it's the empty space in the height of the hangar that is often filled through life. It's of note that we're already using some of that space for the F-35 deployable simulators, which we bring on board through the lifts into the hangar and they hang aft, with access through the aviation complex and the citadel inside the ship. It's a very neat design. Indeed, the Queen Elizabeth class is littered with well-conceived ideas. Other early points were the adoption of electric propulsion, opportunities for layout, space and zoning, and allowed us to separate the prime movers for battle damage resistance. Another early directive was the size of the crew, and it was to be broadly the baseline numbers on the Invincible class carrier, which is a ship 1/3 of the size. This RAND study from 2006, which was around about the time of the design freeze, illustrates the point quite well. The trend is the size of the crew is proportionate relationship to the size of a ship over time. As you can see from the red circle, Queen Elizabeth is very far off the norm. 40% of through-life costs is its people. Operating costs are as important as capital costs when considering your future carrier. It's true to say the crew size has grown. The lift experienced, simply the daily footfall of our engineers to maintain the ship, has meant that we've settled at around about 800, which is still lean to operate a carrier of this size of continuous air operations. The one-star staff is approximately 60, so with the air wing, the embarked Royal Marines, divers and medical, our current capacity is around about 1,700. This may grow into unallocated spaces up to perhaps 2,000 in the future, depending on the number of jets we operate and the variety of aircraft in the future. Another factor was the conditions of service and the need to put those conditions of service into the design. The Royal Navy is very acutely aware of improving both ashore and sea conditions of service and retaining the skills in an increasingly informed workforce. We settled on cabins of 6 people, comfortable quarters, 4 galleys with the latest culinary equipment, space for a gym and even a boxing ring on one ship for those who are fit and brave. It's spacious and comfortable and ready to provide a home for the people we need to train. Queen Elizabeth nears completion of its first operational workup. It has followed this collective training cycle for the first time. It's a progressive approach that takes our people from individual skills at the unit and ship level to coming together under a one-star afloat and culminating in a maritime task group assessment as combat ready. Individual weeks in the schedule may only be weeks long, but the collective is between 6 and 9 months when you overlay it on real-world events, whether that is unit availability, leave, maintenance or upgrades. We also have to accommodate some foreign forces, the US forces who have been assigned to us, and the integration into this training pipeline. It's of note the heavy reliance on synthetics throughout this schedule for both the ship and the air environment. Queen Elizabeth has been designed with synthetic training in mind, as mentioned already, the F-35 simulators that we have on board. But high-fidelity F-35 simulators ashore dramatically drive down the force generation rate. Most of the carrier qualification is done in synthetics, and that vastly reduces the live bill. Recent experience is that as we grow in confidence, this may reduce further. Synthetics doesn't replace all live training, but it will play an increasing part and role in the force generation of the carrier in the future. This is not a fleet schedule, nor is it UK policy. It is merely an illustration of why we have a class of 2 ships to deliver UK policy of continuous carrier capability at readiness. The simple precept is, of course, you cannot get one from one. Force generation factors are a reality of every military asset, whether that is a brigade or an aircraft carrier. Every formation needs to factor in engineering, training and recuperation of its people. The UK carrier model is based around the requirement under Lloyd's registration for a 6-yearly docking of either of the platforms. We will then take the opportunity when they're in dock to upgrade both the platforms. When one is unavailable, the other will be the on-call readiness carrier. The aim is contingent readiness, not the deployment cycle. Operational deployments are of course the tangible output when Queen Elizabeth or Prince of Wales are east of Suez, but they sit within periods of contingent readiness, a carrier ready to operate globally as required by Her Majesty's government. Queen Elizabeth carrier operates within a wider system, as this slide illustrates. It interfaces with organic and non-organic assets through invisible connections and at speed. A 5th generation carrier strike group is a multi-domained operation by definition. At the core is the Queen Elizabeth, with the capacity to deliver a credible air wing of both air power and effective force protection and lift around the clock. It's about a balanced air wing. Configuring the rotary wing elements is as important as the jet numbers. F-35 availability requires a robust supply chain, and it will be the organic lift that supports that. Queen Elizabeth's size gives us the versatility for a tailored air wing to suit the tasks and the threats. The Maritime Task Group historic constraints are force protection, supply chains and maritime surveillance, and they persist today. Rotary wing elements provide these organically with an ability to swing between roles. It's another advantage of the Queen Elizabeth class carrier is the ramp with the incredibly short takeoff distance with a representative combat and fuel load. This leaves the deck aft available for recovery of jets and or rotary wing operations. Its wide beam gives us flexibility, both in terms of backtracking jets or the interferences with simultaneously launching and recovering other aircraft types. We routinely launch a jet forward, recover aft and conduct rotary wing operations from the starboard aft. As I've mentioned, the STOVL reduces the training burden. We don't require a recovery tanker, and we have consistently higher boarding rates than a conventional carrier. The Maritime Task Group needs to balance its organic capability to be untethered and unconstrained, but it also needs to plug into strategic assets, in particular strategic surveillance and overheads, in an increasingly connected battle space. Effective integration across these interfaces, institutional and cultural boundaries requires concerted effort and significantly more time than I have with you today to discuss in detail. As I've mentioned several times, space gives us a future-proofing. There are numerous unallocated spaces, from cats and traps space on 2 deck and further below. These will be used to increase the accommodation as we diversify the air wing over the next 50 years. The last commanding officer of a Queen Elizabeth class carrier is not yet born. The aircraft that will operate from it are not yet designed. We're already looking at options of how we accommodate and operate future unoccupied air systems, future capabilities that will demand power and weight from their host air vehicle and may be substantial. Air-to-air refuelling will be heavy by the fuel it carries. Persistent ISR will need to be robust for the hostile maritime environment. A loyal wingman may need to keep up and will need the power to connect into a 5th and 6th generation air domains. We are engaged broadly with UK industry on multiple strands of activity in support of this future, and the flight deck of the Queen Elizabeth may look even more futuristic than it does today. UK's carrier ambition does not exist in a vacuum. We are, in one sense, 2 more carriers for the good guys. We are inevitably drawn together by shared acquisition programmes such as the F-35 Lightning. The UK was an early partner and has done a lot of its force development with the US Marine Corps. We also have incredibly close ties with the US Navy as a preeminent large deck carrier operator. Early investments in the personnel skills has meant that our UK deck crews have seen and operated and embedded with US Navy carriers and have witnessed cyclical ops at night, which will translate into the future operations on the Queen Elizabeth flight deck. Next year, we have a combined air wing at the very highest level of interoperability and in some places, interchangeability. Weapons integration, combined logistics, shared trainings and procedures are evolving. We have proven that we can design in national sovereign requirements and infrastructures into the Queen Elizabeth class. At an unclassified level, it's not hard to visualise that the space available on the Queen Elizabeth allows us to create the separation to accommodate those sovereign requirements. It's the world's only aircraft carrier with 5th generation operations in mind, designed from the keel upwards, and special access spaces are part of the design. It is of note, however, that most of these national seams are invisible. US personnel are wholly embedded on board Queen Elizabeth, and they add a human depth to the capability. Until now, our integration work has mostly focused with the US. We of course recognise there are many F-35B operators, and we look forward to working with them in the future. As I draw to a close, I thought it might be helpful to offer you a picture of the Royal Navy's engagement across the globe. We are very much looking forward to our return to carrier strike operations. In the meantime, we have an expansive global footprint with ships and submarines operating in every ocean. I hope to have given you the very briefest of outlines of the UK's journey. I focused specifically on the UK choices and the history, and some of it is historic, some of it is still relevant, and some we will need to adapt. But all of it now needs to focus on the delivery of a contingent capability. This was a picture that we have used for many years when it was a concept. Of note, this is now for real and was taken off the UK very recently during workups. So it is now a reality. But there is more to do. Capability development never stops. We're proud of the choices that we have made and we stand ready to help you with yours.